All right. I think we've left enough time here for everybody to join on. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lambda School's Intro to User Experience Design course. My name is Nick Basile, and I'll be your instructor for this course. And the way this course will work is that we're going to spend about an hour or so going over user experience design and its history. And then you'll have some time to work on an assignment that I'll give you at the end of the lesson. And we have some project managers available who are going to help out with the rest of the course. So they'll be on Slack to help with any Q&A, and then they can send out another Zoom link so you guys can have smaller group discussions and go over the assignment when you're ready for it. And then let's see here. Also, if you have a question along the way, please put it in the Slack channel for this course. But please start each of your questions using the question mark emoji, so I can quickly kind of hop in there and scan the chat and respond at the end. So at the end of tonight's course, I'll run through all the questions and answer as many as I can. We'll probably take 10, 15 minutes stops to kind of run through them all. All right, so now that we've got the housekeeping out of the way, let's dive right into it. So every employer out there today wants employees who can wear multiple hats, and they want someone with extraordinary skills. And larger organizations can afford to hire specialists, but most companies need people who can do more than one thing. And user experience designers, more so than other fields, fall prey to companies who want them to do everything from research to visual design to code. If you look at job ads out there, they're typically asking for unicorns, or user experience designers who can create a visual brand style guide for online and print, design mobile apps, be Photoshop or Sketch experts, write advertising and marketing copy, come up with business strategy, perform ethnographic research, and at the same time code in JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And we call folks who have all those skills unicorns because UX designers who have all these skills are incredibly rare. But since everyone is looking for one, there are some high expectations of UX designers. That said, not every company expects the same type of work from their UX team. So we'll talk a little bit about many of these areas in this introductory course, but just realize there's a lot of work available for a designer who can understand and be conversant in more than one of these areas. So user experience is also a field where an outside perspective has a measurable value. A lot of people join the UX profession as a second career, bringing in the insights gained while working in other industries. If you find that the material we cover in this introductory course interests you, you should really consider enrolling in our full-time course that's going to be launching hopefully on October 1st. And we'll give you a strong foundation to enter the UX field and create value right off the bat. So keep that in mind. All right, so let's get into the history of user experience. And in order to do that, we need to take a step back in time to the beginning of computers. Now, the earliest computers were invented in the 1940s and were these huge, massive machines covering like 1,800 square feet in some cases, or basically the size of a house. So users tended to be researchers at large educational or research institutions. And to interact with these machines, users would actually punch holes in cards in order to make them work. So the interface was like a physical tool that allowed the user to actually punch holes in thick stock paper cards, as you can kind of see in the image here. So gradually over time, researchers were able to reduce computer sizes, and they became smaller and began to be used in business applications in the 60s and 70s. Here's another example of a computer getting even smaller and smaller. So during that time, academic and enterprise research organizations continued to invent and refine technologies like the mouse, an early example we can see here, graphical screen interfaces or GUIs, throughout the early years of computing. So IBM, Xerox, AT&T, for example, contributed to the development of important computing technologies we might take for granted today. So this kind of led to the field of human-computer interaction. So HCI researchers were taking on the impact and use of computer interfaces, the processes of technological development, and new applications of technology. So during this time, HCI emerged as a design discipline, sort of the science behind design. And that's where we kind of got the term usability. So the term usability emerges from this research being done and the human factor specialists in industry throughout the 70s and 80s. Usability simply means how easily someone can use a given digital interface or product. So as with most industries, usability has evolved, and design principles that increase interface usability have grown and been refined over time. So as these design processes evolved, usability engineering became part of the lexicon. And researchers like Jakob Nielsen began promoting the idea of usability specifications, where usability was quantified, and those specifications provided a goal for the iterative design cycles to try to achieve and measure progress along the way. And they also advocated for more participatory design, where users took a more active role in the design process. And ethnographic techniques were incorporated in the design process as well, bringing researchers and designers into the context and situation of the user to observe them in their natural habitat, so to speak, and thus have a less biased environment in which to make better design decisions. So as users became involved with the design process, user-centered design became the de facto design paradigm for computer science, with universities rolling out user-centered design courses in their computer science programs and designing user-centered and designated user-centered design as a research focus. And so while today HCI is not entirely forgotten, its influence as a discipline has waned in the wake of the internet and the age of the smartphone. HCI and human factors were key terms used during the 80s and into the 90s, but in 1993, a new term was coined that has caught hold and dominated the discussion of computer interface design outside of academia for most of the last 3 decades, and is used to describe the activities of interface designers in our digital age. And that term is user experience or UX. So cognitive psychologist Don Norman coined the term user experience when naming his research group at Apple in 1993. So Norman had been hired to build a team to improve Apple products. And in 1998, Norman told Peter Merholtz at the design agency AdaptivePath that he thought the term had begun to lose its value. So he said, "I invented the term because I thought human interface and usability were too narrow. I wanted to cover all aspects of the person's experience with the system, including industrial design graphics, the interface, the physical interaction, and the manual. Since then, the term has spread widely, so much so that it's starting to lose its meaning." So shortly after Norman gave user experience a name, Alan Cooper published About Face, which was a seminal volume on interface design. And the second edition in 2003 introduced a new term to the lexicon, which was interaction design. And Cooper also picked up a second author, Robert Raymond. And then in 2009 and 2014, there were continued updates to About Face, more or less matching the pace of technological advancements over the same time period. So additional authors also joined to add perspective and experience to the book's guidance. In the year 2000, Jesse James Garrett, who also first popularized the term AJAX for asynchronous JavaScript, if you're familiar with that, but he published a book proposing a clarified method or model for user experience design on the web and justifying UX as a discipline. So his model of user experience design is worth noting and taking a look at. And it's really a great way to conceptualize the design process and how products are designed and launched. So if we look at the graphic here on the screen, we're moving from the bottom to top. We kind of move from abstract needs to more concrete requirements. So down at the bottom, we have sort of user needs and site objectives, which are very subjective, and you have to go out and do a lot of research. And once you kind of have all that research conducted, you can start building functional specifications and content requirements around that, which then go on to inform the information architecture and interaction design. And now we're starting to move into much more concrete deliverables and design artifacts. Then we start getting into the information design, and this is starting to be what we typically think about what designers are actually doing in their day-to-day. So they're working on the information design, the navigation design, the interface, and finally the visual design, or that polish that give it the real look and feel that we typically associate with modern graphical interfaces. So throughout the 80s and 90s, design of software and digital experiences in general gradually moved from a waterfall process to a more iterative and nimble approach, an agile approach to design. And what I mean by waterfall is that each section of this diagram, for example, was done one step at a time. But what has happened is that the design cycle has been sped up. So the waterfall process is really no longer feasible. Now we rapidly iterate through cycles to come up with a much quicker solution for a problem. So instead of trying to design a product up front, we design pieces and move them through the process. And the rigidity of the waterfall process was really not feasible in this condensed design cycle that we face today. And designers and researchers began to consult users of their products in the design process, rather than solely at the end to evaluate the product. So user research became a formative activity, part of the design process, rather than a summative one, merely evaluating the success of the completed design. So one of the best representations of this are the ideas of the Lean movement brought to UX. And the Lean movement was popularized kind of in the startup world, but it's also been applied to the user experience design process. So in 2013, Jeff Gothelf and Jas Saden published Lean UX to help us understand how a UX process could be brought into the tight cycles of a lean development environment. And there are numerous debates about what it means to be a user experience designer today. There are certainly a myriad roles within the discipline. There are many who call themselves UX designers without understanding the existing foundations and fundamentals of the human-computer experience. It might be easiest to discuss some of these roles and responsibilities in context with the product design cycle. So if you search online for product design diagrams, you'll have thousands of results that are all slightly different, and you can see some of them in the background of the slide. Well, it turns out there really isn't one right way to design a product. And I want to make this really clear up front. There are many different ways to design a product, and a good product could come from a number of design processes. But in this next graphic, we tried to capture what best represents the idealized product design cycle as it's experienced in the industry. So this diagram is not literal. The steps represented are just tools and language you can use to talk about the process. And the steps aren't discrete. They overlap and blend. Like one author said, the emergent nature of the design process makes design rationale both important and difficult. It is a tool for managing the complexity of a process in which everything, including the problem definition, constantly changes. And what we're saying is we have to have rationale for our design decisions. And the process that we use to make those design decisions is extremely important. It's also extremely difficult because the problem and our targets are constantly changing. And so what we're talking about today is a way to think about the design process so this becomes easier and so you understand what you need in order to find a solution. So the product design process steps through the following sections. We have discovery, definition, ideation, prototyping, development, and testing. And the processes feed into each other and continue in a cycle. And once you reach a testing phase, you begin to discover more about the product and can begin to restart the cycle. So our first step in the cycle here is discovery. And discovery comes in many forms. Our next class will focus on explaining and practicing some of these discovery tools, but for today, we'll just touch on it briefly. Discovery is known as user research and is an important part of a user-centered design paradigm. It takes the form of interviews, observation, surveys, and basically any form that we can gather information directly from the intended user of our devices or applications, preferably in a context where they would be using the software we're actually intending to build. The definition phase is where designers analyze findings from the discovery phase. And we'll cover this later too, but there are tools we can use to make sense of all the raw data. There are also processes we use to capture and describe the circumstances and the things users need in order to meet their objectives. Ideation is generally the funnest part of design, and sometimes is mistaken as design itself. Many people think of designers as the idea folks, but that's just one part of the process. Ideation is the expansive, stretching, creative part of the process. It's loose and exciting. It's exploration and generation. But ideation on its own is insufficient to create a product of value. Ideas have to be tested, tried, reformulated, and finally refined before they're built into something better. So prototyping is the start of this refining process. And in the prototyping phase, we put frames around the ideas. Prototyping is dressing the ideas up in various states of fidelity So we can put the ideas in front of users to see how they react. We're trying to be really quick and rough in this stage. So that way we can also use it to form a tight feedback loop with ideation, where ideas are quickly prototyped to generate even more ideas. And prototyping is really meant to give us quick information and will often be the point at which problem definition changes and might require us to start back at the beginning for deeper discovery and start the full cycle again before moving into development. So development, and the way we use this term, what we're referring to is the final creation of the customer-facing product. And the ideas have been tested and refined at the prototype phase to avoid rework and reduce chances for errors at the development phase, since that phase tends to be more costly to a business. Our concept of development includes not only the technical development of code, but also the creation and documentation of the high-fidelity interface mockups that communicate designed intent to the development team. So testing, once a product is live and submitted to users, we test it with them to ensure it meets expectations. And this can be done in a variety of ways, including usability testing and analytics monitoring. So y'all might be familiar with like Google Analytics or Adobe has an analytics suite, and there's a whole bunch of other tools out there that we can use to get that sort of product feedback and do that testing on the products we're designing. So that in a nutshell is the product design cycle. Moving a bit more into the concept of what a designer thinks about when we create an interface, what we're doing is we're creating a bucket of decisions people have to make, a bucket of symbols that they have to comprehend, and a bucket of actions that they have to take to accomplish whatever it is they want to do. And if we're not creating those thoughtfully, these three buckets can quickly become a deluge of information that is overwhelming for people. In academia, we call it cognitive overload, but it essentially amounts to people getting really, really frustrated. They either abandon their objectives altogether, or they suffer through the process, cursing your name, your company, your children, and your pets. And I'm sure this is something that we've all kind of come across in our own experiences using software today. I know something that really gets me frustrated is going to the airport and trying to use the check-in kiosk, and it's either not working or confusing, especially if you're in a foreign country and having to maybe not use the best translated software. Using frustrating software kind of fills up these buckets. And as UX designers, it really is our role and responsibility to make sure that we're not overwhelming our users. So we have to understand that one confusing form field might not be a big deal. One typo isn't the end of the world. But what happens though is that through every extra step, every extra decision, every slightly confusing element, we're putting stress on our users. And it might seem like a small thing, but when compounded, all those little things, like the bugs on the page here, lead to cognitive overload and unhappy customers. And you should be concerned about the person using your app, software, or website. You should care about what they think. Our jobs are to help them. And obviously your employer will have a stake and say in how much time you can spend caring and fixing. But if you make your focus on creating something people have no trouble using, or even have fun and enjoy using, you will always be able to find someone who will pay you good money to help their customers. And we want you to understand a couple of concepts about interface design before we jump into this course that will be really helpful to you in the future. So these concepts, as we're explaining them, come from Don Norman's book, The Design of Everyday Things, which I really highly recommend that you read. It's a phenomenal sort of foundational book in the industry and the discipline. And I believe most UX designers that I've come across have definitely spent some time reading and rereading this book. We'll also be incorporating some examples from the writings of Jacob Nielsen, a usability researcher. So we're reviewing just 3 ideas today to keep it simple, and we'll build on these in the future. These concepts are related to each other, and by considering each one every time you work on an interface, you will make your products better. As I talk about these, I'll be referencing the design of physical objects. If you don't immediately see the relevance to software design, we'll talk about that in a bit, so bear with me. So the first concept I'd like to discuss is the idea of affordance. Affordance means there are physical attributes, sort of visible qualities to an object that suggest how they should be used. When you design something that has a purpose, your objective should be to give that object as much affordance as possible to help people. So in the physical world, affordances manifest itself as pull handles, buttons, and dials. So it's always extremely frustrating to reach for a pull handle on a door and pull, only to then realize that you can't pull the door open. You have to push it open. And in many cases, once such a door has been installed, custodians have to also install a push sign. And usually it's only after you've tried to pull the door that you finally see the sign. So in our picture here, as we can clearly see, the handle says pull, but the label says push. And that brings me to my next concept. Recognition is better than recall. Recognizing the affordance is much easier than trying to remember that this is a push door. So installing a push plate can help you recognize a push door when you see one. Creating a design with an obvious purpose is so much better than trying to remember what something does. So one way to add recognition in an ambiguous context is by adding a label. Reading the sign or label is often better than not having a sign, even if it's a little less aesthetically attractive. So if we look at these two interfaces and we look at the nav bar on the bottom, we can see that the interface on the right is much easier to understand because we have labels on our nav bar items. If we just look at the one on the left, we might be saying like, okay, the checkbox, the check mark, I don't know exactly what that does. Maybe the plane means my flights, no idea what the star is talking about. And okay, the person might be my profile if I kind of have that mental model already established. But on the right-hand side, we have the labels, and they're clearly improving our understanding of the interface. I'll remind you here of the concept of buckets of decisions and actions and symbols I mentioned previously. We can sometimes expect our users to learn something in order to use our products. That's not forbidden. But this is where we must be aware of all these micro moments of annoyance. They can build up into a sea of frustration. If you have buttons that look just like text boxes or icons that have ambiguous meanings, people have to start clicking and tapping around until they find what they're looking for. Their decision-making capacity gets filled quickly, and they drop your app soon after that. So looking for ways to introduce affordance and recognition into your product will improve your product immensely. A bunch of little micro wins will lead to a big win in the end. And then our third concept is called natural mapping. It's related to the other concepts in that it helps provide affordance and aid recognition. Natural mapping refers to the placement of controls relative to the thing that is being controlled. The best example I've seen in the physical world is an oven range. Ranges generally have knobs for the 4 burners on the stove, and sometimes those knobs are placed in a single horizontal row above or below the burners, and you're left to guess which knobs align with which stovetop. Adding labels helps people recognize which knob is associated with which burner, but natural mapping takes that idea a step further and places the knobs next to the relevant burner. So if we look at this example, we immediately know which knob turns on which burner. The problem is sometimes that a product designer will desire an aesthetic placement, a straight line of knobs together, or the engineer will desire to keep like components together to simplify the manufacturing process. But the user experience designer is saying, is that trade-off worth it? Do we gain enough in efficiency to warrant giving people a more confusing experience? So in software, buttons and link are a big place where affordances make a big difference. If you don't give your text a link treatment that is understandable, people won't know to click a link, and you lose out on that option for interaction. Likewise, buttons can often be mistaken as non-interactive if appropriate affordance is not applied. And there's an obvious spectrum of affordance, from a plain white text box to colored boxes, to curved corner boxes, to round and pill-shaped buttons, to buttons with a drop shadow or other 3D attribute that hints at pressability or clickability, all the way up to what's known as skeuomorphism, where the digital components are designed to look like physical artifacts. As I mentioned, icons on buttons are a big place where recognition over recall comes into play. If you use an icon that has been created specifically for the Android environment on a web app that's accessed by all mobile platforms, you lose the recognition power of that icon for half your users. Adding a label goes a long way to helping people recognize what a button is supposed to do. So just like that, we've immediately improved our buttons because now we can recognize exactly what the icons are for. Natural mapping is not as frequently needed in interface design, but being aware of it can help you in situations where you need an easier solution for people. An obvious place for this sort of carousel element would be to place left and right arrows at the left and right edges of the screen, indicating what that control might do, rather than creating a centralized control at the bottom. These are very simple implementations, and discussions of these principles, and the reason I bring them up now, is that even when you've studied and worked hard to understand cognitive design principles and can create an interface, you'll still bungle things up from time to time. Each use case is unique. Each product's user base has different qualities and backgrounds that are hard to know without interacting with them. For you, an icon might seem super obvious and could mean only one thing to everyone. But in testing, you might quickly discern that for your particular audience, that icon has no meaning. And really, the only way to find that out is to talk to your users. For developers and even designers, there's also a big danger of knowing too much about the system. Understanding the database schema, the algorithms, the markup of these under-the-hood elements can blind you to a simpler user experience. For this example, you might say, okay, we need to collect name, email, phone number, and password, and image details to build out the user profile. And the really simple way to do this is to create a form at the beginning of whatever experience you're designing with all the relevant fields and ask the user to complete it. But in testing, the user says, I don't want to give you all my information until I know what I want to buy or a little bit more about the product. So I'm going to put in my throwaway email and a random password, but I'm not going to add my number, my name, or my image. Let me have a chance to look around first, and then if I like it, I'll give you more information. And I know I've certainly done that if I just want to check out a product or see how much something's going to cost me. So the user interface initially becomes a lot simpler, but if we actually designed according to what our users needed and wanted, the underlying code base can become much more complex. But we're trying to create opportunities to collect that additional information in the future. So we've covered a lot of ground today, but we've really only just broken the surface of the history and context of user experience design. We've discussed some names like Don Norman, Jakob Nielsen, and Jesse James Garrett. We presented the concept of the product design cycle and discussed each phase in the cycle. We've also discussed a few design concepts: affordance, natural mapping, cognitive overload, and recognition over recall. So now we have two assignments for you to complete during the next 2 hours. So first, for tomorrow's class, we're going to teach you how to conduct a user interview. And we want you to be able to conduct that interview during the class hour. So for your homework tonight, you can go out and find a friend or family member or an acquaintance or another classmate who will let you conduct a half-hour interview with them tomorrow. So make sure they can meet with you, or we'll let you call them at like 6:30 p.m. Pacific time, 7:30 Mountain, 8:30 Central, I think that might be right, and 9:30 Eastern. And we'll double check those times just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then for the second assignment, we want you to see if you can recognize designers' application of these principles that we discussed tonight in your daily experience. So the assignment you should tackle over the next hour is to evaluate 3 experiences, website, mobile, or web apps, and just take some notes. Who do you think is the intended audience? What outcomes were the experiences designed to achieve? How successful were the designs at achieving those objectives? And then point out design decisions that affect the overall experience. I'll add a link to the Slack group for this assignment, so if you upload your answers here, I can go through and then leave some notes for you. All right, that wraps up the lesson for today. Let me hop into Slack right now and see if I can answer some questions. If you do have questions that you like to ask me directly instead of in the chat, or if you want me to take a closer look at your work, feel free to send me a direct message in Slack, and we can kind of sort it all out from there. Alrighty here. So let me quickly grab the link for you guys to the spreadsheet and then add that in there. So yeah, so for that second assignment, if you want me to review it, oh, not that one, feel free to add your responses in there. And then right now, it doesn't look like we have any questions. But yeah, so if you have anything you'd like to ask, or I guess if no one's going to throw it in the Slack, we can also throw it in the, we can kind of do question and answers here as well in Zoom. Oh, you need access? Sorry. Let me fix that after the questions, and then we'll kind of roll from there. Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it. Yes, I can definitely do that. Let me put them on the screen again. I guess we didn't have them on the screen. Okay, so I will add them directly to our Slack. Just like that. So those again are, who do you think is the intended audience? What outcomes were the experiences designed to achieve? How successful were the designs at achieving those objectives? And then point out any design decisions that affect the overall experience. That's a really good question, Chad. I think that's kind of up to to you to figure out a little bit. Typically, what I look for in an interface, I'll look at the text and look for the tone. So if it's more formal or more informal, that kind of, all right, at least gives me a segment of who they're talking to. They'll generally come out and say it. So on a landing page, they'll probably have a unique value proposition and say, if you're a marketer, we're looking for your, we have the product for you kind of thing. So typically you can kind of ferret it out of interfaces. So yeah, so that's kind of one technique that I use, is really taking a sort of fine-tooth comb to the content and just spending the time to read it and read between the lines and see who they're trying to address. How often are UX designers also UI designers? So the honest answer is it depends. I've met UX designers who are much more focused on the research side of the equation, who really don't touch design at all in the sense that we're thinking of it. The UI designers, I've met several of them who are very good designers and coming up with a brand aesthetic. They actually don't do any of the research themselves. But typically, I've met most folks who have some experience in hardcore UX, where they understand the research and the usability and creating information architectures and doing the interaction design, who are also then able to translate that research and findings into UI designs. So it's probably just a normal distribution where you might have 80% in the middle, and well, that's probably not enough. Maybe 65% in the middle, and then kind of equally distributed on the tails there. So do UX designers also do coding, or only some do? So coding is one of those kind of at least in my experience, stretch goals for UX designers. I think you can be a very successful UX designer and not have to worry about coding at all or ever. That said, and this is kind of approaching that sort of unicorn ability where designers also know how to code, and not just front-end development, but can do some back-end as well. Those folks are typically what you might consider a unicorn. Let's see. So it seems like most UX jobs are very heavily focused on UI. It seems like most companies do not really understand what UX is. Do you feel that most UX designers had to be advocates for themselves so that the company to understand the design thinking process, or even UX research? I think I'm interested in the research part of it, but I don't see a lot of jobs for junior UX researchers. And that's a really good point and a really nuanced understanding of the market these days. You do have to be sort of your own advocate out there, especially if you can get yourself hired into a company that is looking for some sort of UX professional. Typically, they'll say UX professional, and they might not necessarily have known what they were asking for, and that's at least in my experience. So then once you get on the inside there, you can start educating the rest of the stakeholders and informing them about this is what UX actually is and what it really entails. And I've been in those meetings where you really have to present the case for why UX is valuable and what advantages following a UX process brings to the company. And so I've been in those meetings and I've led those meetings, and what I typically find is you can start talking to them about user research and usability studies, and you'll start seeing a lot of people fall asleep in the meeting. But the minute you can present those findings that you know are valid in the context of that business, all of a sudden your advocacy for the UX profession becomes much more real and valuable to that organization. And so that's generally my advice in those situations is how do you flip the conversation from just a UX discussion to how UX brings value to that organization. And then all of a sudden people get very interested in what you're talking about and what benefits UX has for them. I think I mostly answered that. If there's any clarification questions you might have on that one. All right. Any last minute questions? We'll do one final call here, and then I'll let you all go work on your assignments. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it. We'll be doing this again tomorrow night at the same time. So we'll see you all then. Thank you very much.
Nick, can I?
Oh yeah.
Can I say one thing real quick?
Sure.
So, for all the students that are taking this, go ahead, start your homework assignment, and then be back on the Slack about 6:50 Pacific Standard Time. I'm going to open a new Zoom, and that's where we're going to put you into your small groups.